Good evening. Welcome to Canada Tonight. I am Sarah Galashan, and we are continuing our coverage of the latest arrest of former U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump has just left the Atlanta jail roughly 20 minutes after surrendering on the charges related to bid and overturn the 2020 election. And CBC's Katie Nicholson, who you have been listening to, speaking with Andrew, now joins me live outside the Fulton County Jail. Katie, can you hear me? It's Sarah Galashan.
I hear you, yes. Hi.
Hi, Katie. So just picking up on the conversation that you were having, picking up on what you were saying to Andrew, we see the motorcade heading toward the airport now. Have all the vehicles left, though, or are you still waiting for others to potentially leave the jail?
I mean, the sheriff's cars are still all here. The barricade is still up, but I mean, the person of note would be Donald Trump. That is who presumably everybody, all of the cameras are following right now, the chopper view that you would be looking at. So I'm not really anticipating any other high-profile people coming through here right now. Certainly, it was very fast. We knew that this was going to be quick because it was planned out with Secret Service for weeks, and it's a very quick matter of processing. The question now is whether or not there's going to be a mugshot released out of this, and whether or not he was indeed fingerprinted as a part of this administrative process. Typically, most people are when they go through this process, and certainly all of the other members or co-conspirators in this case, alleged co-conspirators, they had to go through this process, and it didn't take long for those mugshots to be released publicly. So that's again, I think it seemed to go fairly seamlessly, and it was quick in and out, and he will no doubt be on a plane very shortly and heading back to Bedminster.
It's interesting that you say that it was expected to be fast. You're surrounded, I know, by U.S. outlets, U.S. reporters who cover arrests and that sort of thing, perhaps frequently. Were they surprised? Are you getting the sense that there is surprise at just how fast this took place, or was this really anticipated that it would be in and out like this?
Most people knew that this was going to be very quick simply because of the security precautions that had to be in place. You're talking about putting someone with Secret Service protection into a facility like the Fulton County Jail, where a number of different provisions have to be made to ensure safety of their asset. Very difficult to do, and so this had to be planned so quickly and so meticulously. And we saw a lot of that as we were here over the last 24 hours. It was a step-by-step process of shoring up all of the security and bringing up barriers and increasing that level of security step by step every step of the way. So that's really it's really maybe it was a little faster than I think some people thought. Particularly how quickly he got here from the airport, but it was anticipated to be a very quick procedure, and certainly probably a little faster than people thought, and sure it was. I mean, these sort of things have to be planned out with meticulous detail when you have that kind of security level that you have to consider.
And Katie, speaking of quick, we are watching the motorcade make its way along the highway back to the airport, where rumor has it, what we understand is that the former U.S. President Donald Trump may speak to the media, may have something to say about the process that has happened here. It's always a little, there's always a surprise element sometimes when it comes to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But is that what your understanding is as well?
Yeah, there was talk of that. Again, who can say? Certainly Rudy Giuliani surprised everybody yesterday when he exited the jail and went through this process. And, I think the thing to keep in mind is that Donald Trump chose this particular time. He knows how to put on a show. He comes from television, reality TV. He knows how to make a splash. And that is certainly what he wanted to do. He timed this to be in the prime times. He wants to sort of really sort of make sure that he is present and in the forefront of everybody's minds. And this, of course, a day after the first GOP debate, the candidate debate that he didn't attend because in his mind he doesn't need to. He certainly is well ahead of the nearest contender in the polls. So this is certainly designed to give him maximum impact. And you hear so many political analysts saying this is certainly designed to take any of the oxygen out of the room so that people are no longer talking about those other candidates. They're back to talking about Donald Trump and this moment in history where you have a U.S. president being processed at a county jail and being fingerprinted and possibly even having a mugshot. So it is this is a prime opportunity for him if he did choose to speak to and do an interview. It certainly wouldn't be surprising if he did.
Well, as you say, he is definitely someone we are talking about this hour, given the extraordinary events that we have just watched unfold. And thank you so much, Katie, for helping walk us through what has been happening at the Fulton County Jail. That's CBC's Katie Nicholson in Atlanta. Okay, I want to now bring in Brian Stetler. He's a former anchor with CNN's Reliable Sources and now Vanity Fair special correspondent. Brian, thank you so much for joining us with the events that we're watching unfold right now in Georgia. Here we are again, another Donald Trump arrest. It's happened. It's not the first time we've seen it, but how historic is this in compared to the other arrests we've seen unfold?
That's the thing. I don't know if the more shocking word in your sentence is the word arrest, that former U.S. president's under arrest, or the word another, that this has happened again, that this continues to happen all summer long. You have different jurisdictions, different prosecutors with different cases holding the former president to account. And let's recognize, in the indictments that we have seen all year long, these are not all for the same alleged crime. These are for different alleged abuses of office and abuses of power that have now piled up against the former president. So as we are talking about this, as we are taking this rightfully very seriously, you still have many pro-Trump media outlets, right-wing media outlets in the United States dismissing this, downplaying it, claiming it's all a witch hunt. And of course, that's what we're going to hear from Trump again later this evening if he chooses to speak at the airport. But for the Trump supporters who are claiming this is all positive for him, it's a good attention, it shows that he's the dominant player in the party. Let's be honest. There's no way for the arrest of a former president to be a positive thing. It's not positive for the candidate. It's not positive for his party. It's not positive for his country. It is a stain on the United States that we're experiencing this right now.
Brian, so there's a few things we're waiting for, two in particular, I guess. One being the mugshot. Does it exist? Will and when it will be released? I don't know what you know about that process. But then the other being, will he stop and speak at the airport? And certainly there's a lot of expectation that he will. What are the chances he doesn't?
In prior indictments, prior arrests, he's actually held, at one point he held a press conference at his golf club in New Jersey. There was another time where he was relatively muted and did not do much press afterwards. But I think, what we will see and what is different about this time, one of the differences is that mugshot. The idea that Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Mark Meadows, these co-defendants, they were all photographed. The mugshots were released within minutes in those cases. So I think we should expect to see the Trump mugshot relatively quickly. Now, of course, his supporters are saying this is going to be held up by his supporters in solidarity. It's going to be, it's going to be a positive for him. Again, there's no way to make this a positive for him that he's been arrested and that there was a mugshot. But I think we know what the message is going to be from the former president. He blasted out an email to his email list saying, "I'm being arrested as an innocent man." He says, "The Democrats are trying to portray me as the real villain when in fact they are the real villains bleeding our country dry." So, that's the narrative. It's more of the same. Here's the reality according to the polls. Most Americans, they don't want to see this. They're embarrassed by this. They don't want to see Donald Trump reclaim power. They don't want to see him back in the Oval Office. However, there is a big chunk of the Republican Party that still stands by him. So we're dealing with this minority group that is so supportive of Trump that he may well win the primary, become the nominee of the Republican Party. but he has an incredibly high hurdle to actually take power again, and that's even if he was not arrested 4 times this year.
I want to talk about those other times, because the difference between those other times he was arrested, it was done at a courthouse. This is different in that it was done at a jail cell, and one that is relatively well known, the Fulton County Jail. Do you think, I mean, knowing, having watched Donald Trump over the years, to some extent, is this a humbling experience for him?
I think this is absolutely a humbling experience, although he will pretend otherwise. This is a man who, for the better part of 40, we could even say 50 years, was able to avoid prosecution, avoid legal trouble in a criminal context. You know, yes, his companies came under a lot of scrutiny in New York, and yes, he had to pay tax bills, but he was able to avoid this side of the law. He was able to avoid this moment happening for many, many years, even though there were allegations for decades of improper and maybe even illegal behavior by his companies. So he was able to stay on the right side of the law in various ways for so long. For him, finally, at this advanced age, to have to go through this several times in 1 year, it is an incredibly humbling experience. And I think about this in the context of the debate last night as well, which, as you were talking about, he snubbed the first GOP debate of the season. He had these rivals on stage, many of them a lot younger, with a lot more youthful energy and exuberance, battling it out for the nomination. I think it's a reminder, frankly, of his mortality. Yes, he has control over a part of the base, but he has also lost a lot. He's lost some support among some voters. He's lost, he obviously lost an election, and he's struggled with some of his businesses post-presidency. So this is absolutely a humbling moment for the former president.
Brian, there's one of the big differences, and there are many, but one of the big differences between the U.S. Court system and what we have here in Canada is the presence of cameras in the courtroom on occasion in the United States. And we understand that the judge overseeing proceedings here has said that cameras would be allowed in the courtroom when this eventually goes to trial. You know, how does that play out? And we've seen other high-profile court cases really dominate social media, dominate news coverage, and my sense is that something involving a former president would very much dominate what is being seen by the American public, if not, frankly, the whole world.
I could see entire television networks being launched just to cover this trial. But there's an asterisk, and that is this trial may not get underway for months. Well, we know it won't for months. It may not get underway for years. Trump filed today objecting to one of his co-defendants, asking for a speedy trial, using a provision of the law that allows someone accused of a crime to get in front of a court as soon as possible. Trump says he doesn't want that. He wants to drag this out. He does not want a trial as soon as possible. He wants the opposite. He wants to try to win re-election in order to stave off these prosecutions. So the likelihood of a Georgia trial on camera in 2024 seems slim, but whenever it does happen, it would be televised, it would be on camera, and that is so important because the accusations made against Trump in federal court, those are damning allegations, but those trials would not be televised. Cameras are not allowed in those courts, much to the frustration of the media. So in terms of reaching a more casual news consumer who hears a lot of noise about Donald Trump but doesn't really know what to believe, it's important to see the evidence, to see it happen on trial. I believe cameras in the courtroom help to build trust in the system. So in Georgia, we would have that, but this trial may be very, very far off. And that's why I think the political calculus here, the political consequences of this arrest tonight are maybe more important than the legal consequences down the line. The political consequences, whether he's able to consolidate more support among voters, whether all of this bad news hurts him among his base, that becomes more of an urgent question.
Brian, your timing impeccable here. What we've been watching happen on the tarmac at the Georgia airport here is reporters getting into a position, a sort of scrum camera position, and we are looking at the vehicle right now, which I believe the former U.S. President Donald Trump is either inside or on the other side of, and waiting to see whether or not he is going to approach those cameras and whether or not he is going to, in fact, have anything to say to them. We're watching this shot very closely. It's hard to know, but it would seem that since the cameras are focused in on this large black SUV, the Suburban, that is the vehicle in which the former U.S. president is sitting. Brian, I'm going to interrupt you.
And it would be a choice for him, of course.
Yeah.
I was going to say, he's made this a television event. He has,
Yes.
for example, brought reporters with him in order to make this even more of a vivid story. And that's because, like it or not, this is his campaign. Being arrested is his campaign for re-election. I never thought I'd see this happen in the United States.
I'm going to interrupt you if he does step out and go to speak, Brian, but what does he, we've talked a little bit whether he would or would he not, and you've just said, speak in fact, and you've just said that this is his campaign. What does he say? He didn't show up to the debate last night. Still, the coverage is all about him today. What is he going to say to those cameras?
I think to the extent that he's been out there, he's not been in public as much as the other candidates running for the Republican Party nomination. Because he has this big lead, he's been able to sit back. He's been able to enjoy a little bit of his summer at his golf club in New Jersey. That's him in his natural element, schmoozing with club members, golfing for the day. That's what he would normally be doing if he was not running for re-election and was not being indicted all over the place. To the extent that he's able to do that, he's able to do that this summer because he is so far ahead. He's not out there in public holding rallies very often. But when he does, he makes clear he believes, well, I don't know what he believes. I don't want to claim I can be in his head. That's a scary prospect. He says he's being indicted because the government's trying to punish his voters. And that connection, even though I think it's rhetorical nonsense, it's a very powerful rhetorical device to say they're coming
Brian,
after
here we
me
go.
to get you.
Brian, I am sorry. As I said, I was going to interrupt you. Thank you for those thoughts. But here we have former U.S. President Donald Trump speaking.
If you challenge an election, you should be able to challenge an election. I thought the election was a rigged election, a stolen election, and I should have every right to do that. As you know, you have many people that you've been watching over the years do the same thing, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Stacey Abrams or many others. When you have that great freedom to challenge, you have to be able to, otherwise you're going to have very dishonest elections. What has taken place here is a travesty of justice. We did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. And everybody knows it. I've never had such support, and that goes with the other ones too. What they're doing is election interference. They're trying to interfere with an election. There's never been anything like it in our country before. This is their way of campaigning. And this is one instance, but you have 3 other instances. It's election interference. So I want to thank you for being here. We did nothing wrong at all, and we have every right, every single right, to challenge an election that we think is dishonest, that we think it's very dishonest. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.
That is former U.S. President Donald Trump making his way now, it would appear, back to his airplane, boarding and then taking off from the airport in Georgia. I want to bring back CBC's Katie Nicholson, who was listening in to what Donald Trump had to say there. Katie, what are your thoughts?
It did sort of echo what we've heard from him before, and certainly he posted on Truth Social earlier today some of those same sentiments about this. He said that he was challenging the election there, and just to sort of delve into that for a little bit, if we look at the indictment, it goes far beyond that, and this all sort of goes back to that so-called perfect phone call that was made on January 2nd back in 2021, in which he asked Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State, to find thousands of more votes. So that is a little different, I would say, than challenging an election. And that is an audio tape that really started to kick this off. So there's a lot of evidence, as has been said before about this case, is already out in the public. So certainly he's entitled to his opinion and to his what he wants to say about this, but it may not be a strong legal argument for him on this. And he again aired his grievances around this. Again, nothing we have not heard from him before on this, but certainly he wanted to send a message that was short and very short message after a very short, I heard 20-minute turnaround here to be processed, and that is the message that he is sticking to. That is his story, and he's sticking to it certainly with this particular indictment.
A short message, not taking any questions, but CBC's Katie Nicholson in Atlanta, thank you. Now I want to bring
You're
back.
welcome.
Want to bring back now Brian Stetler, former anchor with CNN's Reliable Sources, now Vanity Fair special correspondent. Brian, thanks for sticking through. As Katie pointed out, it was a short statement. He didn't take any questions. Final question to you. What did you make of the message, and how is that going to play?
It is a shame for the United States, for the Republican Party, for Trump, that we are still living in the sewer, in the muck, in the garbage of the big lie of 2020. Because that's what Trump just did again, live on television. He once again claimed that he was just objecting to an election that he thought had been stolen from him. It's been disproven hundreds of times, thousands of times. Judges, courts, they've all rejected his lies. And yet, here we are in 2023, still having to deal with his nonsense. And that is something, it's psychological in nature as much as it is political, because the American people deserve better than to relitigate something that's been dealt with years before. And yet, because there are some voters who are with Trump no matter what, here we are focused on not the truth, not policies, not the way to improve the country, not the way to improve the U.S., but instead on that big lie about the election. And unfortunately, that's going to be the theme, because as I said, his arrests, these indictments, they are his campaign. They are the theme of his campaign. He is telling his voters, they're coming after me because they're trying to hurt you. There's no evidence of that, of course. That's an emotional argument, not a political or factual argument, but it is powerful. It is powerful, and it tells us something not about the facts on the ground, but about the gut feelings some voters have.
Thank you, Brian Stetler, Vanity Fair special correspondent and former anchor with CNN's Reliable Sources. Appreciate you being with us for this moment.
Thank you.
Now, for some analysis, we're joined by Michael Zeldin. He's a former U.S. federal prosecutor and host of the podcast That Said with Michael Zeldin, and he is in Washington. Michael, thank you so much. I'm sure you've been listening in here and heard Donald Trump say there that he was not doing anything wrong. He was simply challenging an election, and that has now led to this arrest. Given what you know of the evidence that is against him, was he, do you think, just challenging an election result?
Well, if I were in a courtroom and Donald Trump said, or his lawyer said in opening argument, my client did nothing wrong, all he did was what he's allowed to do, which is challenge an election, I think I would get up in response and say, you know what, you're absolutely right. And he did that 21 times in court, which is the mechanism, and he lost every single one of those. And so when the legal means failed, he embarked on this conspiracy to try to achieve this same objective illegally. And what we are trying here today, ladies and gentlemen, is that illegal effort. And that is what we will ask you to find the defendant guilty for at the end of this trial. So I don't think he gets very far in repeating that big lie argument once he gets into a courtroom.
When does he get into a courtroom? I think that is a big question. There's been a lot of talk about it today, the possibility of an expedited trial starting as soon as maybe October 23rd. Is that possible?
Well, in the United States, there's two things that are running side by side. One is the right to a speedy trial, and the defendant, Chesborough, has requested a speedy trial, and that gets him in court in trial before November. The other thing is the right to effective assistance of counsel. And so counsel, in preparing for a case, has to have an adequate amount of time to prepare. So what we have here is classes of defendants, one who are saying, I want it right now, I'm ready to go, and others who are saying, no, if you force us now, it violates my right to effective assistance of counsel. And that's what the judge is going to have to sort out. There are mechanisms to do that, one of which is to segregate Chesborough's trial, they call it a motion for severance, and just try him alone and try the other defendants, all remaining 18, at a later point in time, or some combination thereof. But we'll have to see what happens when it gets before the judge and we try to sort out the various positions that the multiple defendants are going to try to take with respect to the trial date.
Not to get too deep in the weeds here, but how would it work if you have 19 who are all charged in the same, with the same, not all the exact same charges, but it's the same sort of event? How do you charge them separately and have it not affect the trials of the others?
Well, he's charged with the full indictment and he'll be tried on the majority of the full indictment. It's not like they'll bring a new indictment against him as a standalone matter. They may whittle down the evidence so that they only bring in that amount of evidence that is, one, necessary to tell the full story of what the scheme was, and then secondarily, what role he played in that scheme. So they may not need to bring in all the evidence as to all the co-defendants, but they do have to lay out the scheme and then say what role he played in it and ask the jury to convict. And that's doable. And the others who remain will have their trials when the judge sets them based on their request for trial and their needs for time to be effective in their assistance of counsel.
Since I have you, I want to ask you about RICO and the fact that it's been employed here, and whether or not that complicates proving guilt, given that there are so many charges that are lumped together.
Well, it makes it complicated on one hand and simpler on another hand. Complicated because you have to prove that there is an enterprise that engaged in a series of related criminal activities, and these people were in a conspiratorial agreement to achieve that. The easier part of it is that it lets you tell a full story. You can say, in the beginning, this was where we were, and as we progress through the trial, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear how this conspiracy, this RICO enterprise, evolved and took on various aspects of new activity as their earlier efforts failed. And so you get the full story under the RICO theory that is harder to get in if there was just simpler, straightforward cases to be brought against the defendant. So there's a plus and there's a minus. And obviously, Fani Willis, who is expert in RICO, felt that the telling of the whole story was better for her.
I'll just let our viewers here in Canada know what we're watching. This is Donald Trump's plane taxiing now on the runway at the Atlanta, Georgia airport. We are going to stick with this shot, at least certainly until it is in the air. But I have still with me Michael Zeldin, former U.S. federal prosecutor, and asking you, Michael, a little bit more about the legal process here. And I want to talk to you about cameras in the courtroom, because it's not something, I was talking about this with Brian, our earlier guest, we don't have that traditionally here in Canada. It is something we've watched play out in the United States, and it tends to make big cases that much bigger. We understand that the judge in this case is okay with the idea of cameras in a courtroom for this trial?
Yes, that's what we hear. Now, things could change, but yes, preliminarily, they're saying there will be cameras in the courtroom, and cameras in the courtroom have pluses and minuses. We saw in the O.J. Simpson case what happens when there are cameras in the courtroom where the judge fails to control the parties and everything goes sideways, ending up with O.J. Simpson being acquitted. We've also seen, not in a trial context, but by analogy, the Watergate hearings, where all the evidence came in clearly, where Senator was in charge and controlled it tightly, and the American public, as it watched that evidence, began to believe not that Richard Nixon was the victim of a witch hunt, which is what he said, but rather he was a criminal. And at the end of those hearings, the sentiment was overwhelming that he had committed a crime. So you have here the possibility that these Trump supporters, who right now are all in on Donald Trump, if they watched a jury trial and they saw the evidence come in, witness after witness, most of whom are Republicans, saying, yes, Donald Trump violated the law by doing the following things, then it could be outcome determinative. It could change people's minds, to my analogy, like the Watergate hearings changed people's minds back in the Nixon era.
But Michael, is it also, I mean, having watched these things play out from our perspective up here in Canada, sometimes things are manipulated on social media. It takes up, I mean, there's commentators as well involved taking various clips. Is there not a danger of it doing the opposite, perhaps, and being part of an election campaign, depending on the timing of this?
Yeah, for sure. I think Brian is absolutely right that this is Trump's election campaign. He is not running on policy. He's running on victimhood. And I think to the extent that they can take clips, present them on social media, probably out of context, to show why he is a victim of the deep state or the weaponized Justice Department, and that's why we need to protect ourselves by re-electing him, I'm sure that'll be his campaign. The question is whether America wants that. I think that most people probably are tired of this, but we'll have to see. It's a complicated situation with Donald Trump. You would think at this point, having been indicted 4 times and having lost resoundingly prior presidential election, that they'd say it's time to move on, and that his party would say it's time to move on. But as we saw from the debate last night, people seem to still be in his corner.
Michael Zeldin, former U.S. federal prosecutor. We've reached him in Washington. Thank you so much for all that insight. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Hey, for more, let's bring in Todd Zwillich. He is the Deputy D.C. Bureau Chief for Vice News and author of Breaking the Vote newsletter for Vice. He's in Washington. And Todd, I was listening to you earlier speaking with Andrew, so apologies for your mixing up your name there. But you've now watched the sort of, it was not quite over. We're still waiting for this plane to take off, but you have watched it all play out. You heard from former U.S. President Donald Trump. What is your take on all of this?
Let me say, first of all, all the hundreds and thousands of hours of live broadcast I've done, I would never be mad at a host for dropping a name. It happened to me a million times. We're good. It's a mouthful. I think some of your other guests said it very properly. Donald Trump's messages and his supporters' messages now are political messages, and they're not legal defenses that will work in a court of law. I think that's the first important thing to remember. I'll tell you one thing that's gone on here in the States, which I think is an important corollary to all this. It's Donald Trump, as Brian Stelter told you, got up to the cameras that were broadcasting him live. And once again, for the 10 millionth time, he lied. He lied about his intentions, and he lied about what he was trying to do. He wasn't just innocently trying to challenge an election. He did that 64 times in a court of law. After he lost the legitimate efforts, that's when, according to the indictments, the conspiracy unfolded. The top line of 2 of the indictments is Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. You can only believe and follow the statement that he made there on the tarmac, specifically if you have not read the indictments. Now, he's not been proven guilty yet, but if you read the text of the indictments, they account for this very basic primordial lie that he tells. And the corollary I wanted to get to that I think is important, a couple of the networks I'm just reading online while we're waiting to talk here, a couple of the cable networks here in the States did not take those comments live. They're going to report what Donald Trump said after the fact or take the news and report it. But some of the big networks here, I'm not exactly sure which ones, chose not to take it live. And this shows all too late, many, many years too late, that even live journalism now, in addition to the legal system, is starting to adapt to the Donald Trump phenomenon, that if journalists and producers and reporters and cable executives know that, frankly, Donald Trump is going to fill the space with crap, that's not what your news network is for. So don't carry these statements live. You know what they're going to be. He is newsworthy. I'm not saying don't report it. Tape it. When he makes news, report that a couple of minutes later. And that's apparently what's happened in at least one occasion here on one of the networks. And I just pointed out because it's a turning point. We weren't in this place when Donald Trump was indicted in Manhattan, the first indictment for the Stormy Daniels hush money payments, the 34-count felony indictment there. He flew back to Mar-a-Lago. He promised a big press conference. Everybody went live with it, or most networks did. And you were kind of left with the idea of, why am I watching this sewage? Because my news network is for information and advancing democracy, not for this. So interesting turning point there that I think will be interesting to watch as we continue with these indictments in the legal process and the campaign. They're now intermingled.
Todd, just a reminder to our viewers who are watching this play out on the screen, we are continuing to have cameras focused in on Donald Trump's airplane, his private airplane. It is now taxiing at a slightly faster clip, and it would appear to be taking off perhaps shortly from the Hatfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. We're going to stay with this shot. Todd, when you talk about the lie, I want to be clear with people what you're talking about. What we heard him say is that he has the freedoms to challenge an election, that others have done so before him, and that that's simply all he was doing in terms of his efforts in the aftermath of the 2020 election. That's what you're calling the lie. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And it's simply not what the two indictments that go to the heart of the coup attempt allege. They don't allege that at all. In fact, they stipulate that Donald Trump had the right to challenge elections legally. He did that. When those efforts failed is when the conspiracy and the plot to overturn the election that he lost started. Incidentally, he mentioned Stacey Abrams. He mentioned Hillary Clinton. Stacey Abrams did challenge the results of her losing gubernatorial campaign there in Georgia. She did question it. And then you know what she did? She conceded. And she didn't pursue, and she stepped back. Hillary Clinton conceded to Donald Trump when she lost the election in 2016. So fundamentally just false what he said.
Not to put any ideas out there, but right now we are waiting to see if the mugshot was taken and will be released. It is the United States. We anticipate that will happen if, in fact, one was taken. Is there a scenario in which that somehow is used to an advantage of Donald Trump? And I ask that only because, over the years as we've watched Donald Trump campaign for president, win election, things that you would think would not work in his favor, in fact, have.
I was thinking and talking to a friend earlier today, big David Bowie fan, and David Bowie took millions and millions of cool pictures over the course of his career, but one of the coolest ones he ever took was his mugshot in upstate New York when he was in the Thin White Duke era of his many personas, and he was arrested for pot, I think, in upstate New York, and had a mugshot holding the thing, and it's like one of the coolest pictures that David Bowie ever took, and was definitely turned to his advantage. Sure, his base supporters will take it and wear it with pride. Every time a political insult has been hurled at them, like deplorable, or Joe Biden called them, what did he call them, ultra MAGA, they've turned it into a badge of honor. So they'll do that here too. There have been a couple of well-known hardcore Trump supporters and acolytes online today. Before Donald Trump's mugshot even came out, they've been taking pictures of themselves, copying the format that you've seen with the other co-defendants. So yes, but I think that the advantage of that probably doesn't go beyond the people who already love Donald Trump, give him money, and know that they support him no matter what he's accused of, no matter what he does, no matter how many times he lies, no matter how many courts find him guilty of sexually assaulting women. They're still with him. So sure, they love the mugshot.
I need to ask you about cameras in the courtroom, as I've asked the other two guests as well. In Canada, we don't do that. In the United States, we've seen it done, and sometimes to, I think in hindsight, adverse effect. And we've heard that the judge overseeing proceedings here has said that cameras would be allowed. What do you make of that, and what do you think the outcome or how it might affect perhaps the public perception might be if cameras are in that courtroom?
Yeah, I think it's worth thinking through. There's advantages and disadvantages to it. My view on this, so we have different rules in different venues. You're talking about the state of Georgia. In the federal courts, as you've probably heard, there are no cameras in the courtroom. There's people preparing to lobby here in the United States for the federal court system to suspend the rules or change the rules, because the federal case, the federal coup case against Donald Trump, the 4-count felony indictment brought by Jack Smith in federal court in Washington, D.C., also goes to the very heart of democracy, goes to the very heart of our electoral system. And in fact, as the indictment says, American voters are the victims in that indictment. He is accused in that indictment of violating the civil rights and the right to have your vote counted for hundreds, tens of millions of Americans. So we are the victims as named in that case, and victims have a right to be in the courtroom. So people are wanting to go to Chief Justice John Roberts, who ultimately controls the rules of the federal court system, and say, hey, make an exception here. Cameras in the courtroom are the way that we can see the process working out, the way that we can cut through the inevitable disinformation, lies and spin, fakeness and deep fakes that will inevitably be online. It's the way people can see it for themselves. It's the way they can see that he's not being treated worse than anyone else, that he's not being victimized in the court. It's a very sober, somewhat boring, clinical, prosecutorial, and defense process. Down in Georgia, cameras in the courtroom. I think that there is some risk, but I gotta say my view on this is that for those very reasons I just mentioned, this accrues to our benefit. There will be sensationalism, of course. There will be people cutting it up and spinning it, but there will be millions of people who hopefully will be able to see it for themselves. And because this case goes to the very heart of our democracy, the assault on our democracy, the conspiracy through several different means to overturn an election, intimidate people doing their civic duty, intimidate federal officials into betraying their oaths, breaking into computers to steal data, all of these things are alleged in the conspiracy. I think it's probably going to accrue to our overall benefit in the end.
So we are now watching Donald Trump's plane do what is appearing to be a final taxi as he prepares to take off, leaving Atlanta, Georgia. And let me say, Todd, we're talking about the mugshot there, and what I'm hearing from my producers is, in fact, there was a mugshot. It has officially been released, but getting it off of the website that whoever would have uploaded it to within the Fulton County Jail, that website is repeatedly crashing. There is so much, I guess,
breaking the internet, yeah.
breaking the internet in terms of trying to get a hold of that mugshot. So we are bringing that to viewers as soon as we can. I don't know if that surprises you that there would be that much interest in a mugshot, but it is really the first time, in my understanding, that we have a former president with a mugshot.
Yeah. I mean, it's the least consequential and least important part of all of this, but totally easy to understand why everybody's scrambling to get their hands on that in this visual world, in this visual medium. I get it. I know that your producers are clamoring for it because they get it. And in the end, it doesn't matter really a bit, does it? The other indictments against Donald Trump in the federal coup case, which we already talked about, in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he's accused of just egregious breaches of American national security protocol, then a cover-up, then a cover-up of a cover-up, an obstruction of justice. Those cases didn't have mugshots that were released of Donald Trump, and yet the conduct, it remains alleged, and the alleged conduct is deplorable and remains alleged, and we'll see if it's ever proven in a court of law. So yeah, I mean, I get clamoring for Donald Trump staring up at that overlit, kind of washed out camera setting that they've put out for his other co-defendants. But to me, it's the least important part of this whole affair.
Well, we have now watched as Donald Trump's former president, Donald Trump's plane has now taken off. He has left Atlanta, Georgia. Really appreciate your time with us, Todd, walking us through all of this and your thoughts on this. Todd Zillick, who is the Deputy D.C. Bureau Chief for Vice News and author of Breaking the Vote newsletter. Todd Zillick.